Okay, so welcome everyone. This is our Smooth Move program to help you support those in your life that may be transitioning off campus. This is designed for family, friends, whomever, and we want to make sure that you all are able to ask questions that are most important to you. So please utilize the chat feature, and we will make sure to pause throughout this presentation to address any questions that you all might have. But ultimately, we want to let you know there are many resources and offices here to support you and your student as you think about that move to off campus. So we're going to do some quick introductions first. So my name is Dilna Kama, and I am part of Student Life within Off-Campus and Commuter Student Services. On the screen, you will see our contact information. We are located in the Ohio Union on the 3rd floor. We support students from the moment they get on campus and start thinking about life off campus all the way throughout their college career up until graduation and beyond. So a lot of the resources that we talk about, you'll be able to access from our website, which again, you will find on the screen. And next, I'd like to have Molly introduce herself.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Thanks so much for being here. My name is Molly Hagerty. I'm the Managing Director of Student Legal Services. And if you're not familiar with our office, we are a nonprofit law office that Ohio State has chosen to contract with to provide legal resources, advice and representation to eligible Ohio State students. So our offices work very closely together throughout this journey from finding housing to moving and living off campus. And we'll talk about some of the specific services our office provides throughout the presentation.
And then finally, we do want to highlight another office within Student Life, which is a Student Wellness Center. They offer a lot of helpful information, resources, and support for students, but one in particular we're going to talk about is a Scarlet and Gay Financial Coaching Program. So we'll talk about that in a minute as well, and you'll see all of 3 of our websites on the screen for you to reference in the future.
Okay, so before we get started here, I do want to encourage you all to use the chat feature if you do have questions throughout. We will answer the questions in the chat either in the chat themselves or in the program, depending on what the question is. And I am monitoring the chat while Dilna is helping to facilitate the presentation, PowerPoint presentation. So want to move to timeline. And as you might be aware, our office has been strongly encouraging students to hold off on signing leases if possible until the spring semester at least. Each year, our offices feel like the off-campus housing search starts too early as it is. And there's a variety of different reasons for that. One, it's hard to know whether the people that you think you want to live with in your September, even of your second year, end up being the right people to be living with for that next academic year. And also, we feel like in general, the pressure leads students to make decisions they might not otherwise make if they were to be given time to make those decisions and to do the research that we would suggest that they make. So that's that, and off-campus housing generally follows a familiar time frame each year, but obviously this is different. And we had a question that came up in the chat about asking whether or not a decision has been made about mandating sophomores to live on campus for fall 2021. As far as we know, the answer to that is they will be required to live on campus. Second years will be required to live on campus for fall 2021. However, things do change as we've seen throughout rapidly, and our offices are not the ones who make those decisions, although we help to push out the information as soon as we do hear about that. Donna, do you have anything to add on that end?
No, I think we are functioning as if it will be a typical year next year, and then if we find out otherwise, like Molly said, we will make sure to communicate that to all of our stakeholders.
Great. Um, and, we do have some questions, and these are questions that have come up with your students as well, is whether or not there is enough off-campus housing available for students if they wait until spring. And the answer is yes, with a caveat that those houses that are larger and there are fewer of them, obviously with supply and demand, those are going to go more quickly because there's less of them. And and usually those honestly get handed down from one set of students to the next anyway. And yeah, I mean, to address some of the comments in the chat, they keep hearing now is the time, now is the time. Quite honestly, that is pressure that the students put on themselves and that the landlords tend to feed into. Really what we want you to know is there's not a rush. So there's no hard and fast deadline or date by which they need to sign the leases, especially if they're looking for some of those, smaller properties, which would be, up to 4 and 5 people in a property. There's going to be plenty of that housing stock available. What has happened over the years is with the second year live on requirement that took a lot of the beds out of off campus and put them on campus. And then all you have to do is go around the university district to see all of the new builds. So there's far more supply than there is demand at this point. And Dylan and I have been doing this for a really long time. And part of the reason why you're hearing now is because before the second year live on requirement and all these new builds, that was the case. You were going to, the housing stock would be pretty much all taken up by end of January, beginning of February, but that's just not the same case now. And we do a lot on our end to try to keep it from happening so early, but there's only so much we can do in the private market to ensure that the landlords are pushing this out and this messaging out. So I think what you need to do is, if you want your student to wait, is just to help to reassure them that there will be available properties. And an example would be for those students who did use the second year housing exemption this year. So they said, when it was offered that they would want to move off campus as opposed to staying on campus, they took that exemption. They were looking for housing at the end of July, beginning of August. All of them found housing, and as far as our offices are concerned, from what we've heard, there really hasn't been there haven't been a lot of issues with those, and they've found housing that suited their needs. The more questions about that, does it include housing close to campus? Yes. Donna, can you speak to kind of the number of available properties in general in the university district, and to give a sort of sense of numbers?
Sure. So in a typical year, we have about 15,000 or so students living on campus in the residence halls. Then off campus in the university district, so that area we consider walking distance to campus, which is about a 2.4-mile radius. We are guesstimating that we have anywhere from 16 to 20,000 students living in that area. And then the remaining 25,000 plus students are commuting. And so we definitely have seen that there is the supply that we have within the university district, especially now that we have a lot more new builds coming online each year, we're going to have plenty of available properties for students seeking housing walking distance to campus, and certainly those that are looking to live further off.
Mm-hmm. We do have some questions about whether the new builds are more expensive. That's really going to depend. Generally speaking, yes, they are more expensive, just based on the model that they're pushing out for these new builds. They are more expensive. Although I know there are a few different places where you might find less expensive. In general, those are going to be more expensive than the older housing.
And the cost of rent, it really varies. So the average amount of rent, I mean, I could try to guesstimate that maybe it's around $600, $650 a month off of what we have seen, but that's per person, and that's assuming that someone is living with at least one other individual. It does tend to be a little bit more expensive if you are living by yourself in, say, a one-bedroom apartment. Now, this is not to say that there aren't more places that are less expensive, and certainly places that are more expensive as well. We encourage your students to talk with their peers that have lived off campus in the past to get a better sense of what they've experienced as well, to get a little bit more information.
And I think I want to reiterate here too, let's, not to focus so much on an exact date about when they should be signing, but really about the process itself. You all are doing such a great job in helping to facilitate this by showing up to these programs. And I would also encourage you to have your students come to our programming as well. Really, what we see is not so much losing out on housing or anything like that become the issues. What is the real issues is when students rush into making a decision without doing any research or homework ahead of time, and then so because they feel pressured by other students or by the landlords themselves, and then they come to move in next August and realize they've made a decision that they're not happy with. So really what we want to focus on here and what we're going to go through is, what are the ways you do your research, what are the conversations to have, and what are the things you want to be aware of as you're looking for housing. And also, once you've moved off campus, what are the things that you want to be looking for? So I think we're good. And I will also be answering, when Donna's talking, some of the other questions in the chat.
Great. Thank you, Molly.
Yep.
Okay, so next we just want to cover a little bit about budgeting, since we've talked about timeline, and considering your student's particular financial situation in order to create that realistic budget. So ultimately, we would encourage that your students are utilizing the Student Wellness Center's Scarlet and Gray Financial Coaching Program. This is really helpful. It helps the student to really solidify a budget if they need to, and really allowing you and your student to determine what they can afford, and not just rent, but also utilities and additional costs that they may incur. So first, obviously, considering the income, so the amount of money the student's bringing in from financial aid, a job, if they're having contributions from family and friends, whatever that might look like. Next, thinking about those fixed expenses, whether that's going to be the rent, vehicle insurance, renter's insurance, which is really important, which we're going to talk about, internet, etc. And then certainly those variable expenses that your student may have, things that are going to fluctuate from month to month, groceries, utility bills, entertainment, etc. And then we, of course, want our students to make sure that they're saving a little bit of extra money, so that if things do come up, they have to get their car fixed, for instance, they have that money available to them. One of the things that I'll have Molly discuss is understanding and knowing the difference between a holding deposit versus a security deposit when your students are going and looking at places and or talking with property owners.
Thanks, Donna. So in addition to the lease contract that students are going to sign, that obviously obligates you under the law as a legal contract. But there's also in Ohio a specific set of laws in the Ohio Revised Code, that's the Landlord Tenant Act. And that governs the overall relationship between landlords and tenants. So you're going to have both of those combined that are going to make up what are your students' legal rights and responsibilities, and what are the landlord's rights and responsibilities. And one of those things that's covered in the Landlord Tenant Act is the security deposit. So as you might all be aware, most landlords are going to require a security deposit, usually equal to 1 month's rent, either at the time of signing or at some time before students move in. And basically how we tell the students that this works is, that's a promise that you're making to the landlord, that when you move out of your property, if there's any unpaid rent or damages to the property over normal wear and tear, the landlord can take out of that security deposit to basically pay themselves back. Okay, and there's different processes and different notices you have to give, and we talk to the students, and we can talk to you all about that next semester when we go into the nitty-gritty for parent information. But there are certain things under the law that are required in order for the landlord to hold that security deposit. Okay, what some landlords have started doing is asking for what's called a holding deposit. So basically what they say is you're looking at the property and you really are interested, but you're not sure whether or not you actually want to rent. The landlord says, okay, that's fine. You can give me a certain amount of money. And sometimes we've seen them as high as 1 month's rent. You give me that certain amount of money and I'll hold the property for you. Okay. So it's not a security deposit. And they're trying to get around some of them, the security deposit law that is, governed under the revised code. And so they take this amount of money, and what happens to our students is there's nothing in writing that says what happens to that holding deposit. If they rent the property or if they decide not to rent. So there's nothing in writing. It's maybe only an oral promise or oral conversation, which is really hard then for us to go and enforce. Okay. So if this is really important, if your student is talking about putting down a deposit that's not a security deposit, so it's a holding deposit to keep that property off the market, we want to have something in writing that says exactly what happens to that money. How long do I have to make my decision? When do I get the money back? Are you going to take a certain percentage of it if I don't rent the property? If I do rent the property, are you going to now use that as my security deposit? And that's what that will become. So that's really vitally important. We have seen this year a lot more landlords using that holding deposit as kind of a way to, I think also it's another way to make students feel like, well, this property could go anytime. And so we just want the parents to be aware of that. Okay. All right, and I get to keep talking. So renter's insurance, really, really important. We think that students should have renter's insurance both on campus and off campus because that's the type of insurance that's going to cover your personal property, but particularly as it relates to off-campus housing. So the landlord is going to have insurance for their property itself. So the four walls, the insulation, the electric, plumbing, all of that. But in the event something happens to the property, let's say a fire, a flood, a break-in, those kinds of things, and your student's personal property is lost, the landlord's insurance is not going to cover their personal property loss, your student's personal property loss. So we want the students to have a separate renter's insurance policy. We get asked this question all the time, or get told, okay, we definitely want to do that. That makes sense to us. But our homeowner's insurance covers our student while they're away at school. We love that. That's great. You should check with your homeowner's agent or check your policy. The issue with that is that your deductible on those homeowners policies is going to be pretty high. So the example we give students, and when we present to students, we really walk through like, this is what renter's insurance is, and we explain to them what is what's a deductible, what's a premium, what's a claim, all of those things, because I didn't understand any of that when I was in college. So we want to have this conversation. So no, we're talking to them about this as well. So the homeowners versus having a separate renter's policy. I say, like, imagine that you have like $3,000 worth of personal property loss in a flood. And we've seen this happen. So several years ago, a tree fell on an apartment complex on 9th Avenue. One of the units was completely destroyed. Everything in it, mattress, clothes, books, all electronic equipment, everything was destroyed. Could not be used again, okay? $3,000, that's a lowball estimate, right? If you go to your homeowner's insurance, you may have a $3,000 deductible. At that point, you're out of luck. The renter's insurance policy, which is a separate policy that would be taken out in your student's name, the premiums are pretty low. They're usually between $10 to $20 per month. And that deductible is going to be a lot lower. So it makes sense for you to put out that premium cost so that you'll be able to make a policy claim, especially in those where the loss is right around what your deductible would be, okay? So that's the homeowners versus the separate policy. Some landlords offer in their lease a renter's insurance policy through them. We want to be really careful about taken the landlord up on that. Now they might require it, which is one thing for you to sign a lease, and generally they're allowed to do that unless it's like astronomically expensive. But if they give you the option, I would say no, and I would get my own renter's insurance policy. And the reason being, usually those policies are far more beneficial for the landlord than it is for the tenant, and it's covering the landlord's losses, and sometimes doesn't even cover any actual loss for the tenant. So we want to be wary of that. Now, where do you find renter's insurance? There's lots of different places offer it. We have seen it. We don't endorse any. We don't get in that business from a liability standpoint. That's just not good, and attorneys can't do things like that. But we want you to go to your either your homeowner's insurance or your car insurance and ask if they offer renter's insurance, because usually they'll bundle your policies and that might make the premium come down. Otherwise, there are some that we've heard about. Lemonade is one that's pretty popular with students, and it's an online. Just make sure you're reading through what exactly is covered and isn't. This is a very good reason for your student to schedule an appointment to come in we're doing them by phone, to talk to one of our attorneys. If they don't know what that renter's insurance policy means or whether or not it's a good policy, we are happy to walk through that with them. And with their permission, you can be on the phone as well. So that's renter's insurance. And I'm going to look in the chat because I'm guessing there's going to be some questions about that. So give me a second so I can take a look through.
And I've looked at some, Molly.
Yeah.
There is a question. I'm just going to move it to our Q&A slide. One of the questions that still has to do with budget was asking about application fees. Typically, are students having to pay an application fee, and what does that look like?
Yes. Students typically have to pay an application fee. The application fees have to be reasonable and related to what it would be to process an application. So if you're seeing application fees that are like $100, that's too much. Anywhere between $20 and $50. Ostensibly, that's supposed to be used to run credit and to check backgrounds, basically see, has this person ever been evicted before? The landlord's able to do those types of things as long as it's not a pretext for discrimination. They're allowed to do certain things like run your credit and that type of thing in order to assure themselves that you would be a good renter. But if we start talking about more than $50 per person on an application fee, that's getting to be too much. And we would want to talk to you about that, or it might be a sign for you that maybe like this is a landlord who's going to start tacking on fees. Okay.
It looks like another question we have, are leases usually 12-month, and what options do students have if they're not attending school for the summer? So yes, typically leases are 11.5-month leases, and the property owner allows you to make 12 equal installments. So typically, Molly, I believe we see leases are starting mid-August and then going through July 31st. Go ahead, Mom.
And be careful, like very clear on the lease language allows them to charge you for 12 installments. So it's not like you're going to get a prorated for that half a month. You're still paying for those 12 installments. Would each student need their own renter's policy if multiple are sharing a property? Yes. I advise that they each have their own. The reason being is, God forbid, one of them is the one who starts the fire. If they all have, there could be some liability issues down the road if you're all sharing. And that brings up a good point too. When you're looking at a renter's insurance policy, you do want to see if it covers your own negligence, because you don't want to be. Accidents happen, things happen. We have seen, a student put something in the oven, falls asleep, okay, and causes a fire. We want to be sure that that's still going to be covered for the student for their liability. Okay. Scarlet and Gray coaching offered free to students, and is it a form or process online? It is one-on-one coaching with peers. So if you go to Student Wellness Center's website, they have all the information about Scarlet and Gray. If your student is a STEP student, they will be required to do the Scarlet and Gray financial coaching through STEP. But all others, you can use it and it is free.
Go ahead. I have a question. What do you think is a reasonable parking fee and contract from landlords? So in terms of parking, it varies what a property owner provides. They may have a parking lot and offer that for free for the tenants. They might have a parking lot and charge, I'm making this up, a $25 a month fee per car. And some may not have off-street parking at all, and so your student is having to park their car on the street. One thing we do want to point out is that a lot of the streets off campus do require a city parking permit. So there's a process to purchase a permit, which it historically has been $25 for the year, not providing a private spot on the street by any means, but gives students access to park on a street and maybe a couple neighboring streets as well.
Okay. Let's see. Uh, let's see. List of landlords with ratings. Okay, so Donna, do you want to cover that?
Sure. So our undergraduate student government, they put out a survey each year. It's called the USG Renters Guide that they compile these results in. So they ask a series of questions to students. What was their experience like with their property owner, with the area? Did they feel they received a fair amount of their security deposit back after the lease term? A whole slew of questions you would be interested in. They compile that into the USG Renters Guide, which you can find on the USG website. We've also linked to it from our website at offcampus.osu.edu. And so you can look at that and see how have peers rated specific property owners. And if someone has rated very low, perhaps that's something that you would want to think twice about. That's something you all have to make that decision. What is most important to you and what might stand out to you as an issue. In addition to utilizing that USG Renters Guide, we do encourage students to talk with their peers. So say they go and do a tour of a property and they're really interested, ideally when the property owner's not around, talking with the current tenants and asking them, hey, what was your experience like? Did you have any issues? Was it positive? My biggest question would be, why aren't you re-signing the lease for next year? So I think those are some helpful tips to help, as well as allow your student to maybe get a sense of what are the utility costs going to look like, right? Usage, of course, varies, but you can get a sense of what those utility bills might look like in the following year.
Some of these we will actually end up answering as we move forward. So let's go ahead and keep going, and then we'll backtrack to see which ones were not answered as we move forward.
Great. Thank you, Molly. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about off-campus and commuter student services. This is your central resource for off-campus living, and our website has virtually all of our information on there. So one, we keep in contact with local landlords around the area. So if they choose to, they post their information. It gets featured on this online housing search. Couple things to notate: these are not university endorsed or approved property owners or property owners. We are simply serving as a resource center, letting you know what's out there and what's available. And we are providing you all with the tips and tools to make the best decision for your student and their particular circumstance. So when you're utilizing this online housing search, as you can see on the screen, you can be as general or as specific as you would like to be. There's actually a more advanced search on our website as well if you want to be even more specific. But ultimately, your student can put their criteria in, click search listings, and it'll narrow down based off the criteria that was initially plugged in. I will provide full information, what the rent amount is, where it's located, Google Map it. You have a sense of if it's walking distance or not, if it has air conditioning, dishwasher, all those different pieces that one would be interested in when looking at housing. And then your student can contact the property owner directly to either ask more questions, get further information, or to schedule a time to potentially view the property. Some are offering virtual tours, others are still doing those in person. So that we wanted to point out in terms of a good starting point when doing that off-campus housing search. Next, we'll talk about how to evaluate properties, right? So you guys already were asking great questions. So we talked about that USG Renter's Guide, which is that compilation of ratings from students that have rented from a variety of landlords in the area. We also encourage students to speak with the current tenants, again, to get a sense of what the property owner was like, the property itself, as well as the neighborhood, and get a sense of what utility costs might look like. And then next would be questions for the landlord, right? So if your student goes in and views a property and loves it, but say the carpet is completely trashed and the property owner, agrees to change the carpet, those are the kinds of questions your student can ask. Will you be doing X, Y, and Z? And if the property owner says, yes, we commit to doing these things, that's when it's essential to talk with Student Legal Services, because they're going to help draft that in writing into the lease. When talking with the property owner, you can also, if you feel you need to negotiate the rent, this is also a time where you can talk to the property owner about the rent amount and see if they are willing to negotiate that. But these are 4 things we would suggest are crucial to making that decision when evaluating the different properties that your student may be considering. Okay, so next, searching for roommates, right? So a lot of your students may already know who they want to live with, which is fine. And we're going to talk about some of the things that will be beneficial for them to really talk through before they sign a lease. But many may have identified that they want to live off campus, they want to live with others, but haven't necessarily identified who those individuals are. So students with their Ohio State username and password can log on to our website with our online roommate search. They can post an ad if they would like to, so individuals can reach out to them. And they can also peruse the roommate ads that already exist. So there will be information, compatibility questions. Is this someone I would even want to contact to get to know further? And then certainly answers about the property itself, where it's located, what amenities are included. In addition to the online roommate search, we offer roommate fairs. Currently, those are also virtual through Zoom. Those we post on our website, offcampus.osu.edu. We post the dates and times for those as we have them, so you would want to have your student check there if they are interested in attending one of those roommate fairs. Regardless if they're living with someone they already know or they find through our roommate fair or some other platform, it's going to be really important that they do talk through and sign a roommate agreement. When students are living in the residence halls, it's much more of that social agreement to be able to get along as roommates. But when you're living off campus, this also now becomes a business contract, right? This is now a financial agreement that you all are working together to pay the rent, to pay the utilities. And so Student Legal Services will discuss further the implications of signing a lease, especially as it relates to signing with other individuals.
And I think we should probably go past these questions right now, because we're going to get to the meat of some of the questions at this point. So if you want to, well, understanding the lease. So thanks, Donna. So really important, if you can, please encourage your student to have their lease reviewed by our office before they sign. Once they sign, they're legally obligated on the contract. Usually we find the students are going to still move forward with signing, but at the very least, if there are changes that need to be made, or we find some really big red flags, that might mean that you don't end up moving forward. That said, if they have signed a lease, I still encourage your students to have a lease review. And again, we're doing those by phone, so you can join in as well, and the roommates too. It's actually come to be an even easier process for us this year, doing these virtually and remotely, as opposed to having to have everybody in the office and doing it that way. The process is a little bit different this year than in previous years. We've streamlined to allow us to meet the needs of more students. And so when you go on to our website to schedule, you'll see that the student is required to watch a 20-minute video before they schedule their appointment for a lease review. That covers in real depth all the things that we hit with every student in a lease review. The appointment with the attorney is then about their specific lease. So it's going to go through all the line by line, and that attorney is going to come through it and point out anything that wasn't covered in the lease review video, and then any specifics about the lease that they want you to be aware of. Very important to have that second piece, because leases in Ohio, for those of you who have not rented here before or are coming from other jurisdictions, leases in Ohio are not standard, meaning that there's not one type of lease that every landlord uses. And in fact, some of the landlords who have properties, all over Columbus may have a different lease for the university district than they do if they're renting to young professionals in Dublin. So we really want to go through and point out, the specifics of that lease. The next thing we want you to be really thinking about for understanding the lease is that the majority of leases in the university district have a joint and several liability clause in them. And in non-lawyer speak, joint and several liability means everybody who signs on the lease is obligated for the entire rental amount plus any damages that are caused. And I'll talk about what that means for the cosigner in a moment. But as far as the students, so my example is you have because I'm not good with math, so I use really easy. So you have a lease for 4 people that's $2,000 a month. The students think to themselves, okay, we each pay $500 per person, right? And that's what everybody would think. If you have that lease with the joint and several liability clause in it, what it means is if one of those roommates just disappears and does not pay the rent, the landlord is able to try to recover the rent, not only from the person who left, but all 3 of the remaining roommates as well, and any damages that are caused. So let's also say, in this example, one of the students ends up having a party and everybody else is out of town. If you've got that joint and several liability lease and that one roommate's friends caused a lot of damage to the property, everybody's on the hook to pay the landlord for those damages. And the landlord can come after any one of those people or all of them together. And so that's very important. And also another reason why we want to back up that roommate agreement where students are talking about these issues before they move in, that social and that money aspect. We're now, if you have a party, it's not just that you're annoying me. It's that I could be responsible when you break the refrigerator or whatever it might be. So again, going through that roommate contract ahead of time is so vitally important for so many reasons, but especially for this joint and several liability. Then most leases in the university district also have require a cosigner or a guarantor. And the way I explain that to students is, students generally don't have credit, and if they do have credit, it's bad credit because they've gone and taken out a credit card and blown it to the limit and not paying it back. So the landlords, for some reassurance, go and ask for a cosigner or guarantor, basically someone who does have an income, does have some credit, to sign on behalf of that student to say, if the student doesn't pay, then I will step in and pay. Whether or not you are jointly and severally liable is going to come down to the contract itself. So there are some where you're co-signing just for your student, okay? But there are others where you're co-signing jointly and severally. So you too are on the hook for your student and 5 of his best friends, one of which you may leave. So just be, aware of that. Also things that can be covered in the roommate agreement. You could also add, additional, if you want to get the co-signers involved, you could do that as well, where you add in provisions that say, in that agreement, I'm only, the lease may say this, but between all of us, we know that I'm only responsible for my portion. So if the landlord comes after me, I have my agreement that says, if I pay the landlord, I'm suing you. So those are some really, really important pieces. At this point, we probably do want to turn to the questions, Stilna, just to see if there's anything that we haven't gotten that.
Sure. So we have a question that someone wanted to confirm whether they heard correctly. OSU is not expecting to offer a second year exemption for fall 2021. Again, we are simply operating under the assumption that everything will be business as normal starting fall 2021, which means sophomores would be required to live on campus. That being said, things can change. We don't know what the future holds. And so if new information comes out where again we're allowing exemption of second year students, we would make sure that we're communicating that as soon as we hear and find out. Let's see. We had another question, which I think we answered. What about subleases if studying abroad? Is that a possibility? Certainly, we do offer through offcampus.osu.edu a sublet, an opportunity to post available subleases, as well as look to sublease from someone. So that could be subleasing an entire one-bedroom apartment or a room in a multi-bedroom unit. But keep in mind, a lot of students, for instance, in the summertime, want to go home, do an internship, whatever the case might be. So we have a lot of students trying to sublease and maybe not as many students trying to rent for just the summer. So we always operate that under the assumption that you're going to have to pay, your students going to have to pay all 12 months. And then if they're able to find someone to sublease, that's an added bonus.
Another question was, there's a requiring a one-time payment for the year parking fee of $50, and it's new for the next year. Can landlords require that? Yes, if it's a new contract term, you know, you're signing on for basically a new year, they can add an additional cost in there for that, and that likely would not be seen as an unreasonable fee for parking. You know, you can choose not to pay for that if you want to park on the street, but that's one of those things that they could. And in fact, $50 is pretty low for what some of the landlords are charging for parking in their lots. But I would also encourage your student to talk to the landlord about what that $50 entitles them to, because that's where some wires get crossed and things are not clear. Does the $50 guarantee me a spot? Does the $50 just allow me to park in the lot? I'm not guaranteed a spot. Are they allowed to clear the lot for game days? Sometimes, you know, there's not any tailgating and there's no spectators in the stadium right now. But in, you know, future years, that might be the case where the landlord uses the lots closest to the campus for game day parking and charges for that. And if it's not clear about what that $50 entitles you to, they may be allowed to do that. Is there a fee for services from student legal services? This is a great question. And I think that came up elsewhere too. So our office our fee is charged to students. It's an annual fee, and it's charged to all eligible Columbus campus students, and they are eligible if they're not otherwise considered an employee, and that's not going to be the majority of your students or any of them probably. And then we're not talking about student staff. We're talking about like Dilma, if she was taking classes, she's a full-time staff member, she would not be eligible. So that's $40. Students had the ability to waive our fee at the beginning of the term of enrollment, which is autumn for most students. If they waived, they can't use our services. If they kept our fee, then they are entitled to speak with the attorney as often as they need to for that $40. So that's all covered. It's not an additional cost. You know, outside of just the lease review, if you were ever to, let's say, have to sue your landlord, the filing fees with the court need to be covered by the students. That's not covered by our fee. But as far as the attorney service, that's all covered by that $40. Let's see.
Looks like someone's asking about safety ratings for different neighborhoods. The Columbus Police Department does offer online, you can look at the crime statistics. The area that's adjacent to the campus area is precinct 4. If you visit offcampus.osu.edu, we have an entire safety tab. And so you'll find a link to that along with a lot of other safety resources that are available throughout the city of Columbus as well as through Ohio State University.
We have a question about the the lease or comment about the lease reviews and not being able to get in. And I apologize that you didn't have the opportunity for that. I would still, Kathy, have your students schedule and we will review it with them. I still think that's a valuable educational tool for your student, particularly when we're talking about unenforceable lease clauses, because oftentimes we tell students they can still sign a lease even if it has something that's unenforceable in it. Just that if they try to enforce it against them to come in, because most landlords will not take those provisions out of their lease. There's no requirement for them to do so. It only ever becomes an issue when they try to enforce it. And I also want to say, for students who may be having trouble getting in, please call our office. Parents encourage them to call our office to schedule. We might have cancellations the day of. We also have a wait list. And I can make sure that information is on the website if it isn't already. So Kathy, apologies that your student could not get in for a lease review by the time they needed to sign it. But that said, for everyone else, please, go ahead and call our office or email us to see if there's any cancellations or day of appointments available. And also, if they've already signed, it's still a good idea. All right.
One person wants to know, what is the phone number for Student Legal Services? It's 614-247-5853, which we'll also type out for you guys.
I got it, Dilma.
Okay, thank you. It looks like another question, will this Zoom meeting be available to us at the end so we can share with our student? Yes, know that you will have that link, but also we have done a very similar program and it's targeted to students. So we can also make sure you have access to that if you would like, so that your student can look at either or if you would like.
I am looking through the chat if you're looking through questions just to make sure.
Yes.
Parking on campus to attend classes, how does that work? Lori, so if you want to park on campus to attend classes, they have to get a parking pass through Campus Park. And that's generally is that by term, or it can be monthly as well, I believe, to buy a parking pass. So they should look out for that information over the summer to park on campus. Difference between individual lease. I think we talked about joint and several liability. No, most leases are not individual if there's multiple tenants in an apartment, although some of the newer properties are renting individual beds. And then they're saying that the common areas are jointly and severally liable. So you're responsible for your own bed, but then the common areas, everybody's jointly responsible. That's still up for debate. There's no real precedent legally whether or not that they can enforce that, but do know that that's in the leases. Sophomores, just to come back around to sophomores living off campus. This year there was an exemption provided to sophomores due to COVID. However, we are operating under the assumption that second year students will be required to live on campus next year, barring any other major changes, or so that's what we don't have any other information other than that. And as that information is pushed out to our offices, we push it out as well through our channels.
I have a question here. Should each student make an appointment with Student Legal Services to review the lease, or should they go in as a group?
So they can absolutely come in as a group. It's up to them. It's whatever that they are more comfortable with, as long as the roommates are eligible for our services, which they don't have to figure out when they schedule. They will put in whether or not they want any roommates to join us, and they put their OSU dot numbers in so we can check eligibility. And then they also tell us whether or not they want their parents to be on as well when we do the lease review. So it's really up to them whether or not they want to have the roommates on the call, or they just want to do it themselves.
We have a question. Do most of the off-campus housing choices for students, oh, sorry, it moved. Do most of the off-campus housing choices include utilities, or do students need to contact the utilities and establish service? So great question. Yes, in a lot of situations, the student is going to need to set up the utilities on their own. Not to say that we don't have some property owners that do offer the rent utilities included. And so that is something you'll need to have your student pay attention to and ask the property owner directly to know which situation that would be for that particular property. We have some property owners who, it depends which building you're renting, some they offer utilities included, some not.
Okay, let's see, what percentage of sophomores typically secure dorms listed as limited access? I don't know the answer to that, but I'm going to put in housing's website, and that would be a question for university housing. The website to review neighborhood safety ratings. So it's not just safety ratings for the undergraduate student government renters guide. It's a whole host of things, but they do talk about safety in their properties. So we will list that. Donna, can you find the link for the most recent one?
Sure. Yeah.
But also,
go ahead.
CPD. Did you cover CPD yet?
I did. I'm just going to list on here our website, and there's a safety tab. All of this information can be found on that safety tab.
Yes. Okay. Let's see. So guidelines for students on subleasing to others, such as keeping their property for use, such beds, that kind of thing. Okay, so subleasing is a contract separate from the lease itself. So the lease is between the landlord and the original tenant. If you're going to sublease, that's a separate legal contract between the original tenant, and the person who's coming in and taking over. And so we want to make sure that the agreement between those two parties is in writing. And so we actually have a sample sublease agreement on our website, studentlegal.osu.edu/off-campus, that we tell students to use as a guide. However, if you want to add additional terms into it, you certainly can, in terms of like, I'm leaving my property here for your use. And, if it's damaged, I can, basically come after you to recover the cost, that kind of thing. But I think it's really important for students to understand that when they are subleasing, if you're the person who's subleasing your property to somebody else, you still have an obligation to the landlord under that original lease. All right, unless you can get the landlord to do what's called an assignment, which most landlords in the university district will not do. For this type of situation, the original tenant is not assigning away their rights under the contract to the other person. It's really the contract between the two people. So another thing that we want to be really careful about for subleases, and if your student is thinking about subleasing to anyone or subleasing from anyone, is, does the landlord allow subleasing? We see sometimes the situation where a student will sublease to another student. That other student is living in the property. Landlord comes to do a maintenance and is like, who are you? Come to find out, the lease does not allow for subleasing, and that student can be evicted out of the property. So again, want to be really careful. That's something that you can come and talk to us about. We will review your situation. We want to see that lease, the original lease with the landlord, and then walk you through the sublease agreement.
Looks like we have a question. Is there a way around the joint and several liability clause?
Generally, no. It's just what the university district landlords use, and in general, they're going to just move to the next person in line. So that's unfortunate. We don't love it, but there are problems as well for some of these individual apartments leases as well. Because usually if you take a look at those, let's say you have a 4-bedroom and you're renting one of the beds, most of those properties have a provision that if someone leaves, they can put anybody else and replace them in there without your permission, or, not permission, but without you having to agree to that new person coming in. So, there's a give and take on both of those. You certainly can try though. That's not to say that you shouldn't try. Your lawyer is going to tell you, yes, try to negotiate that if you can.
We have a question. What happens if the students decide to rent a second year? Is there an additional fee since the lease isn't a full 12 months? Great question. If, a group of students rents a place in 2021 and they decide to stay and lease again for 2022, then they will need to do, Molly, what is the
Lease renewal.
Lease renewal, the landlord will ask them by a certain date to indicate if they want to continue that lease for another year, but then they're not going to have to move out for 2 weeks and move back in, because now the property owner doesn't have to turn over the property. So they'll be able to then stay for a full 12 months.
Yeah, and when they do that lease renewal, that's another reason for the student to come in and talk to us about what they, what they should be considering, whether this, there's any changes in the lease renewal, that kind of thing. And do know that when you're re-signing the lease, that is an opportunity for the landlord to increase the price. So you do want to pay close attention to that. Parking spots, just a parking spot. I don't know where you would go about finding something like that. I would guess the students would probably use something like Facebook for that, but there's no, to my knowledge, there's no like repository of, hey, here, I have a parking spot that I can give you to lease. Let's see, my son is signing a lease, pre-lease for August 2021. Do we already, that's okay. We already answered that one. Okay, so let's go to the chat real quick and make sure that we've covered everything over here. Do we want to move on to some of the other things that we have?
Sure. So in terms of, sorry.
We've gone through the roommate agreement. So do we want to go on to the health and safety?
Yeah. So in terms of when your student is living off campus, we did want to highlight a few things. We do provide free safety devices for students. Again, all this can be found on our website. I know I keep highlighting that. So we offer free window and door alarms, free safety timers, as well as 9-volt batteries for smoke alarms. So once students know how many windows and doors they have, they can go online to our website and reserve a date and time to come and pick up those devices. In addition, we encourage, most of your students probably already have the OSU app on their phone or whatever device they utilize, but this is a really helpful app. It'll allow students to do a plethora of things, whether it's get safety resources in addition to what we have on our website, to learning about the different bus routes that exist, what parking looks like on campus, if they have crisis or emergency and they're trying to be routed to the right person. There's a lot of helpful information that can be found through that OSU app. In addition, we wanted to highlight 311, which is the City of Columbus Service Center. You can even access this through the CBUS app, CBUS for Columbus. So 311, there are so many things that you can utilize with this app. For instance, report a street light out or a pothole, know when trash is being collected in a specific area or recycling is being collected. So a lot of helpful resources from the city as well. So we encourage students to download both of those apps. And then in terms of COVID, the reason we put that in here, which I think we've touched a little bit on already with roommates, but especially with your students potentially living with other people next year, it's really important that they talk about expectations specifically centered around health and safety, right? So some students are going to be comfortable having 2-3 guests in the home while still staying under the 10 per household, and others are not going to be comfortable with that at all. So really talking about expectations. Are we going to allow guests? If we travel or go home, will we be as roommates requiring each other to quarantine afterwards? Making sure that there's an understanding if someone were to test positive, how are we going to communicate that to the rest of the roommates, and how are the roommates going to jump in potentially and help support that individual? Will we have specific cleaning expectations? And I could go on and on, but really just making sure that the students are talking with each other very clearly about what their expectations are of one another and how they will hold each other accountable.
We do have a question about the safety and recent events. And the information, specific information regarding those types of incidents would not be found on either one of our websites. The Department of Public Safety would probably be the best bet starting point for that. That being said, there is a task force that was convened by President Johnson to address safety concerns. Actually both Dylan and I sit on that task force, and we are working through a pretty quick pace, getting information, and then going to be making recommendations that will be presented to the board. And so I encourage you that if you do, there are opportunities for parents to participate in these discussions. And if that is something that you're interested in, I think, I don't think the task force website is live just yet. Is it, Dilna?
I believe it. Yes, it is.
Okay. So there is information on the task force website about how you could become involved in particular, I believe there are some focus groups for parents if you would like to but if you're just interested in gathering information, it should be on that website. It would not be housed on either one of ours. The OSU app and CBUS app, those are both, if you just search for Ohio State in your app store, and then CBUS in your app store, you will find either one of those. As far as a checklist for inspecting the property, some of that we will cover in next semester's off-campus housing, because we can't cover everything. Just a small session, but if you want to move to, we're on the next one. Sorry, I got the chat up in front of me. So we will be offering parent sessions next semester as well, to once your student has secured the housing they're going to be living in for 2021, 2022. Then we want to talk to you about the nuts and bolts of actually moving in and then living off campus. One of those things is talking to you about what are the steps you need to do to ensure that you will get your security deposit back at the end of the lease term. And one of those things is a move-in checklist. And so what you do is go through and document the property, as there's any damages to the property, stuff that's not working, that kind of thing. I would use that move-in checklist as a guide if you are going through a property and viewing it. It's a good resource. And that's also on our website at studentlegal.osu.edu/off-campus. So that move-in checklist is under security deposit tab. We'll also go through the steps for requesting repairs and getting repairs made, and what happens if the landlord's not making repairs. We'll talk to you about lease renewal, you know, when that usually comes up. What you need to be looking for, subleasing, so a little more detail about the subleasing, and then answer any other questions that you might have about that not just looking for housing, but now we found housing, now what are our next steps? So we will cover that, and that will be, we absolutely will send that information to the people who register. We will keep this list and send that to you, because we know that you're interested in this process and for you to sign up, but it'll also be marketed on our websites and widely on, you know, parent and family relations and that kind of thing. So that was a lot of information. And this is, so, and an understanding that this is what we do, you know, we talk to your students about. So it can be a lot all at once, which is why we, at the end of every session that we do with your students, we suggest and we highly encourage them to touch base with us. We are here, this is our jobs. We want to help students the best way that we can. And so, you know, we want to put faces to the names and make sure that they understand that there is support for them here. You know, sometimes students who move off campus feel like, oh, I've lost a connection to the university. Well, that's their mission at off campus, just to make sure they're still connected. And it's our job to ensure that they feel empowered in the relationship between themselves and their landlords. We also cover a whole host of other legal issues, just to plug in here for our office, and you can view that on our website. But really important for your student to understand, if they're ever hesitant to come into student legal services, we are not a university department, so we're a separate entity. And we're also all covered by attorney-client privilege. So if a student comes in and wants to talk to us about something and they're concerned about confidentiality, please reassure them that we can't even share with parents unless they give us permission to do so because of the nature of the relationship between an attorney and a client. So what other questions do we have? Anyone want to post up? Oh, thank you. And as we get last questions, this is what I do with your students too. The top 3 things: renter's insurance, lease review, and also understand that you do not have to put up with inadequate housing or a landlord who's not treating you well just because you're a student. That is one of the reasons, one of the big things for me is that's why we're here. There is a power differential. Certainly it feels like that. But with us on their side, we are evening out the power. And the more that they do in terms of research and the more that they do to educate themselves, the better off they will be. And even just as far as using our notices when they're talking to their landlords, when they're giving their landlord a repair request, all of those things. I talk to student legal. That is going to help you. Another thing I think parents do hear from students is, well, my landlord told me that Student Legal Services already approved my lease. That is not true. So you still want the lease review, regardless of what the landlord is saying. And if the landlord doesn't want to give you the lease for it to be reviewed, that is a red flag. Okay, quick repeat about what to put in the roommate agreement to protect all students for one student's damage to the rental property. That guide is in, Joanne is actually in that the sample roommate agreement about, if it's one person who causes the damage, that should be in there specifically. But if you have further questions, I think you have my email, Joanne, so we can touch base after that. New builds are everywhere. So where are the new builds located? Everywhere. Everywhere from as far down as Short North that students are living in. So if you're familiar with the area, High Street starts down, goes German Village, downtown, Short North, South Campus, through campus, then North Campus, then Clintonville and up. Those of us who have lived here and been here since students, we call it, the young professional, the yuppie progression. You start in the Short North, you live on campus, then you go to Clintonville, and then you live in Worthington. It kind of follows High Street. So it could be any number of those places where the new builds are. There also are some on on West Campus, right, Donna? Closer to the stadium and in the Grandview area.
Yep. We have a question. Once a lease is presented, what is a reasonable amount of time within which a student should be required to sign?
Well, my answer to that is going to vary from what the landlord's answer would be. The landlords are going to want you to turn that around really, really quickly. We have had quite a bit of success with students, and in fact, this is something that came up with my own niece, who is going to be renting for the first time off campus, and they wanted her to turn it around within a day. And I said, whoa, you need a little more time for you and your roommates to take some time to look through this. Once you have dad call and find out, we have another day or two, and that they were successful in doing so. So sometimes just, a little nudge and helping them either to navigate that conversation themselves, or you help them navigate that, just to give you a little bit more time. But usually, the landlords are going to want you to turn it pretty quickly. But we, try to get that lease review in there.
Any other questions?
We'll stay on for another minute or two just to see if anything else comes up. But otherwise, thank you for being here today. We really appreciate your partnership as we try to help your students as they go through this process. We understand it is new, and some of you are veteran parents, and some of you this is your first timers. And so we do want to reassure you, we are trying to help your students as much as we possibly can. And as you can see, we are open for talking to people. So contact our offices if you have other questions. Sometimes it might be a legal question for my office, and we do have to refer for your student to schedule an appointment. But sometimes if it's just general information, we absolutely can get that answered.